Welcome to part 2 of an introduction to our Victorian estate, Zehr Estate. Charlotte Wells Slaughter, widow of Samuel Slaughter, was an active community member in Waverly and other nearby communities. She was active with the Presbyterian Church, Women's Missionary Society, conducting Regents exams, Susquehanna Valley Home, a state orphanage, the DAR, being a descendant of several prominent Orange County, New York pioneers, Ladies Auxiliary of the People's Hospital and Robert Packer Hospital, reading circles, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, being a charter member, musical club, part of the executive committee for the Waverly University Club, a branch of the University Association and World's Congress Extension with their headquarters in Chicago, attended delegate meetings of the New York State Bankers Association. After her husband's death in 1894, she inherited the home, the rental property, and the corner drugstore building, which he had owned, but at the time of his death, he was using it as rental income. She continued to rent out the rental property, an octagon home at 7 Athens Street and the corner drugstore, corner of Broad Street and Waverly Street. Her obituary said the village was called to mourn one of its most influential women, and whose passing will bring sorrow to a large circle of friends. It was also stated that she was a liberal giver to all of the church's charities. As Samuel's widow, Charlotte had the responsibilities of the estate and the rental of the drugstore for 18 years. Samuel and Charlotte's daughter, Mary Gertrude Slaughter, went by her middle name Gertrude. She was only 4 years old at the time of her father's death. While attending Waverly schools, Gertrude was a member of the Delta Theta Delta. In 1908, she attended college at the Elms, Miss Porter's School in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 1911, Gertrude graduated from the Emma Willard School at Troy, New York, and then went back to take postgraduate courses. In 1912, due to her mother's death, Mary Gertrude Slaughter inherited her family's home, along with the rental property, octagon home and corner drugstore building, at just 22 years of age. About 2 years later, she was engaged in May of 1914, and in February of 1915, she married George Brinker Knapp, son of Joseph and Frances Knapp. The wedding took place in the home. In 1916, Gertrude and George had a baby girl, Charlotte, named after Gertrude's mother. Gertrude and George spent their winters in Florida. George died in 1927 when their only child, Charlotte Knapp, was 11 years old, and leaving Gertrude a widow, just as her mother had been left a widow. Gertrude, too, like her mother had been, was socially active in Waverly and nearby communities. The Presbyterian Church, Ladies Benevolent Society, Women's Guild, and Women's Missionary Society, Mothers Club of the Lincoln Street School, on the original committee to bring fresh air children to Waverly, a dancing club, a musical club, treasurer for the People's Hospital, Tioga General Hospital being on the executive committee, Girl Scouts being a leader, president of its community and scout commissioner, Shepherd Hills Country Club on the Women's Auxiliary and treasury of the auxiliary, executive board of the Valley View Country Club, member of the DAR, and at one time its treasurer, and in 1939 vice regent. Child's Conservative League, Rotarian on the executive committee for the Red Cross, member of the Waverly Garden Club, Waverly Polyhymnia Club, co-chairman for the Tioga County Tuberculosis and Public Health Association, canvasser for World War II war bonds, aircraft observer during World War II, and secretary for the Waverly Free Library. Gertrude Slaughter Knapp died in 1956 at 66 years of age. She had been born and raised in Waverly in this home at 208 Chemung Street, and raised her daughter in this home also. I find it interesting that our home stayed in Gertrude's name, even after her marriage to George Knapp. The home was never put in her husband's name. His time period living in the home from 1915 to 1927. After George's accidental death from a gunshot in the home, in a second-floor bedroom, Gertrude had the responsibilities of the estate and the drugstore rental for another 18 years, the same amount of years as did her mother before her. In 1927, George Brinker Knapp had died from an accidental gunshot in the home. His daughter Charlotte was only 11 years old. George Brinker Knapp killed by charge from shotgun. Prominent Waverly man dies instantly when gun is accidentally discharged at home. George Brinker Knapp accidentally shot himself at 5:30 Saturday afternoon in his bedroom at his home. Mr. Knapp had been ill for several weeks and had only recently returned from Glen Springs Sanitarium, Watkins Glen, where he had been receiving treatments. He was much improved in health, however, and was making plans to start on a brief squirrel hunting trip with friends this week. Mr. Knapp had just taken a bath and returned to his room to dress. Mrs. Knapp, his wife, was on the first floor of the home and was making preparations to take Mr. Knapp for a short automobile ride before dinner. Hearing a noise, as if someone had fallen, Mrs. Knapp hastened to her husband's room and found him lying upon his back on the floor with a large wardrobe trunk, which stood in the room, overturned and lying partially on Mr. Knapp. A shotgun, which had been lying across the top of the trunk and which Mr. Knapp had been cleaning in readiness for the hunting trip, had been fired, probably as the trunk had fallen and the charge had entered the body of her husband, passing through his chest. Dr. F.H. Spencer, the family physician, was summoned and found that life was extinct. He called Coroner J.T. Tucker, who made an examination and decided that the death was accidental. The decedent was born in Waverly in November of 1885 and had resided in this village all of his life. He was engaged for a short time in the dry goods business with his father, but had retired from active business life some years ago. Mr. Knapp, while not taking an active part in the civic life of the village on account of ill health, was one of the best-known citizens of this community. He was a member of the First Presbyterian Church of Waverly, a member of Tioga Hose Company, and a charter member of the Shepherd Hills Country Club. In the later organization, Mr. Knapp always had taken a very active part. Being an ardent golf enthusiast, he had played in most of the tournaments of the past few years, and for a time was chairman of the tournament committee and also of the Greens Committee. He was a director of the Citizens National Bank. He is survived by his widow, Mrs. Gertrude Zehr Knapp, one daughter, Charlotte, at home, his mother, Mrs. Joseph W. Knapp Sr., who resided with her son, and three brothers, Harry and Joseph of Waverly, and Ralph, at present in Warsaw, Poland. Funeral services will be held at the late home, and they will be private. Reverend Albert O. Caldwell, pastor of the Presbyterian Church, will officiate, and interment will be in the Glenwood Cemetery. Gertrude and George's daughter, Charlotte Zehr Knapp, never married and never had any children. She was born the first generation who would have the benefits gained by the women's suffrage, a fight that lasted for over 70 years. In 1957, she was listed as an honorary member of the Honorary Society in Mechanical Engineering at Cornell University. A few years after her mother's death in 1956, Charlotte moved to California, where she died on February 7, 1985. I have not been able to find any information about Charlotte after her move to California. I did learn that she came to Waverly in the summer of 1984 for her 50th Waverly High School class reunion, and then about a half a year later died. Very interesting is that in the summer of 1984, Brad and I were living in one of the third-floor apartments here in this home. Brad was helping paint the exterior of the home when two women approached the home, and one of the women said that they had lived in the home, and when Brad asked which apartment she had lived in, she responded by saying the whole home. Brad and I did not know the history of the home at that time in 1984, as we do now, and we were renters back then, not the owners that we are now with the interest in the history. We now know that the woman was Charlotte Knapp, having one last look at her family's home. How I wish we would have known who she was back then, and that we knew the history that we do know now, the questions we could have had answered, and the possible pictures we could have seen. At the time of the class reunion, she was living at 5162 East Florence Street, number 2, Bell, California. In the class notes, it said that she had previously worked for the College of Engineering at Cornell University as a secretary. The women of this home were very social, involved with the community, and entertained in the home with many meetings, gatherings, and parties. There is no mention of the Octagon home that was at 7 Athens Street after the year 1933. In 1945, the Slaughter Estate was sold to Mary Fralick, who turned the estate into a 9-apartment complex. 6 apartments in the main house, 2 apartments in the former carriage house, and 1 apartment in the outbuilding. She had 6 garages added to that outbuilding, 3 on the upper level and 3 on the lower level. In 1950, Mrs. Fralick sold off a building lot where the Octagon home once stood at 7 Athens Street to Mary Alamo, who had the current ranch-style home built. Mary Fralick was born in Bradford County in 1896, the daughter of Perry and Mary Huff Ellsbury. In 1912, she graduated from East Smithfield High School. Her first husband, Loren Pierce, operated the Marilorn Cabins in Waverly for several years with her. She married her second husband, Ralph W. Fralick of Kingston, PA, in 1943. They lived in the Marilorn in Waverly until purchasing the former Slaughter Estate in 1945. Ralph and Mary lived in one of the first-floor apartments in the main house, while renting out all the other apartments. In 1958, the apartment complex was owned by Robert and Vera Callison. Robert was born in Bowser, Texas, and attended schools there. In 1912, he moved to Arizona and attended the Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation School in Bisbee, Arizona, where he became a mining engineer. He was a veteran of World War I and later graduated from the El Paso School of Mines and worked for Ingersoll Rand at El Paso. He was transferred to the Athens, Pennsylvania plant. He was then sent to Mexico City and Central America for the Ingersoll Rand, and he joined the New York, Honduras, and Rosario Mining Company. In 1926, he returned to the Athens plant and married Vera Carpenter. He then went to the Northern Peru Mining and Smelting Corporation. After returning to the United States, he was at the Phelps Dodge Corporation in Arizona. He then went into business for himself as an oil distributor in New York. Later, he managed the El Dorado Mining in El Salvador. He liquidated the El Salvador and the New York, Honduras, and Rosario Mining Company and returned to Waverly, New York in 1957. Robert and Vera lived on the east side of the first floor in the main house while renting out all the other apartments. Mr. Callison was a Village of Waverly trustee for several terms. After selling the property in 1970 to my father, Richard Morris, the Callisons remained in their apartment as tenants. Robert Callison died in 1973. Vera Callison remained as a tenant and then later remarried, becoming Mrs. Vera Coveney. See Victorian Estate 3 for the conclusion of our introduction to our Victorian Estate.